So Outdoors Queensland respectfully acknowledges the traditional owners of the lands where we gather across Queensland and across Australia today. We pay respect to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge the important roles played by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples regarding sky, land and waterways that are used for outdoor activities. I'm in Brisbane, or Meanjin, on Yagara country, which is a place of the Jagera and Turrbal peoples. If you'd like to, you can pop in the chat the place and the country that you're joining from today. And yeah, Matthew's just said in the chat, yeah, please rename yourself if you can, because that's just one of those. We had a little gremlin with the link we sent out. We also, I just want to acknowledge the funding that's provided by Queensland Government to support outdoor activities across the state. And we acknowledge the work that government departments and ministers do regarding outdoor activities, including sport and rec, who are within the Department of Tourism, Innovation and Sport. So today's forum, the Australian Adventure Activity Standard and Good Practice Guides. Firstly, the introductions there. As you may know, my name's Dom Courtney. I'm the Executive Officer, and my co-host is Mark Squires, Operations Manager from Outdoors Queensland. I'd like to welcome all of you. Like, we have attendees from a really impressive range of organisations here today to discuss the Adventure Activity Standard and Good Practice Guides. We generally try to avoid acronyms where possible in any of our sessions, but for today's session, I will slip into using Australian AAAS and GPG purely because if I say Australian Adventure Activity Standard and Good Practice Guides too often, we'll probably run out of time before we get to the third slide. So yeah, if I use an acronym today, you'll know why. But yeah, if you have any questions or comments as we go along, feel free to raise your hand in the functions, in the reactions bit on the Zoom, or you can always type in the chat and ask your question that way. So yeah, but yeah, this is a forum. It's about an exchange of ideas, and questions are more than welcome. So we'll get straight into it. So the Australian Adventure Activity Standards and Good Practice Guides, they identify essential considerations that help providers apply a systematic approach to management, planning and delivery of adventure activities for dependent participants. So that's straight out of the standard. And what it's really all about, I think, is this structured framework. So the standard, which is on the screen there, this diagram is actually in the standard. It provides the key requirements for preparing and delivering adventure activities, so the what. The core Good Practice Guide is recommended common practice, supporting information that's relevant to all types of adventure activities. So that's the general how to do these things. Then the Activity Good Practice Guides, which is specific information on risk management and common or good practice for that specific adventure activity. So it's a more specific bunch of how statements, how to do things. Does anyone have any questions? I'm conscious some of this you'll be well aware of, and others you may not be. So I'm happy to take questions as we go along. Pop up your hand or just pop it in the chat. So I just saw Janice has asked, will the slides be available yet afterwards? Yep, and we'll have a recording on our website as well, Janice. So yeah, these will be there. A lot of these slides I've taken straight out of the standard. So none of the information here is protected or anything. The Australian Adventure Activity Standards and Good Practice Guides are all freely available on the website. So yeah, it's all there for everyone. So, oh, and I just saw David's just shared the link to the website. Thank you, mate, in the chat. Yep. So, and Mark's just said also we'll post it on a link on our forums page. So yeah, there you go. This diagram's also in the standard, and I think it actually sets it out quite well as far as what the standard's all about. So it's identifying essential considerations to help providers apply that systematic approach to management, planning and delivery of outdoor activities. So that's, again, the wording in the standard. So they do this through a structured framework that outlines the importance of, and it steps through those steps that are shown in the diagram. So developing contextually relevant risk management processes and procedures, undertaking planning to design, prepare and support adventure activity delivery, identifying, understanding the abilities and needs of participants and the importance of timely communications, ensuring that equipment and environments are appropriate and fit for purpose, and selecting leaders with appropriate skills and experience to lead the activity. So you can tell from that, this is not just something about safety. The adventure activity standards or standard and the good practice guides, it's not just a, here's the rules, now go and apply it. It's more about guidance for developing these systems. And the components are discussed separately in the documents, but they're all interrelated. And what it says in the standard again is that providers are encouraged to consider how to address each component, but how they work together in your particular adventure activity management system. So that's a really key point of this, that this is about how it works in practice and what these standards actually do in this. I want to get to that and raise it so anyone can talk about your experience with the standards as we get through today's forum. So again, please, if there's any questions, I'm conscious I don't want to go through it too quickly, but I also want to sort of get through some of this background information so that people can comment on your experiences and how you might have already implemented these standards in practice, which I think would be a really valuable part of this discussion today. So the standard itself, as I said, it addresses the common requirements for all types of activity, what should be considered. So that's the what. And you'll see that the key areas from that diagram on the previous slide are used as the headings of each section of the standard, and that consistency flows through into the good practice guides as well. So it's about, in the standard, it's what must be considered by providers in these key areas that was handed down by a technical working group made up of experts from across the country. So I should have said they were released in November 2019. Unfortunately, COVID came along in early 2020. So the implementation, I think, of the Australian Adventure Activity Standard, we started on that. We actually ran a webinar. I think Mark reminded me today, it was our first ever webinar that we did in November 2019 to, I guess, announce or support the release of the AAAS. And then COVID came along. We also ran another webinar about bushfires. As you may remember, the 2019-2020 summer, we had the terrible bushfires, and then COVID came along and sort of derailed a whole lot of work. So that's why we're sort of trying to pick this up now and talk to it with the industry. And it's great to see so many people have joined us today. So going on with this, the standard itself, those key requirements for preparing and delivering adventure activities. Then the core good practice guide. So it's information again about common practices, but it's how those practices should be considered. And it's really resources to help providers develop your procedures and your processes. So the example that we've used before, and I think it's a good one, is if I'm a provider and I work in a bushfire prone area, the core good practice guide actually provides information on bushfire, prescribed fire and fire danger in the context of all outdoor activities. So it's intended to apply to all activities, including activities for which there's not an activity specific good practice guide. So just because if you're running an activity and there isn't an activity specific good practice guide, you can still get guidance from the core good practice guide. And there's a heap of theory and examples in the appendices to the core good practice guide, which is certainly worth a look. And you'll see again, I've just screenshotted that the contents overview there with the same, or pretty much the same broad outline as the standard in the content, so in the same key areas, and that's about making it easier to implement in practice. So the good practice guides. So there's the list of these are in addition to the core good practice guide. So there's 12 activity-specific good practice guides, and they collectively cover 18 outdoor activities. So the inland water paddlecraft good practice guide actually covers 5 activities in one document. And they provide information on how the practices should be considered in the context of that particular activity, for example, caving or sea kayaking, snorkeling or fishing. So those ones are that's the list of activities, but as I said, there is also the piece of if your activity is not actually, you don't have a good practice guide for the activity you're undertaking, you can still take some guidance from the core good practice guide as well. So, and I just should have said, Mark's just shared a link to the core as well. So thanks for doing that, mate. All right. So getting into the some of the detail of it. So who's covered? And this seems to be a question that comes up a bit. So I just wanted to spend a bit on the time on this. If you've got any questions, please sing out. So the general statement that's in the standard is any organisation, business, community group, government agency, school or others who organise and lead adventure activities with dependent participants. And it does define dependent participants in there, which is people who rely on the activity leaders to support their participation in an adventure activity. And the next piece there is about providers needing to determine if you're working with dependent participants. And that can actually change depending on the different programs that you're offering. There could be times when you're working with a group of independent participants and all the participants are independent. You can still get some guidance for how you could conduct your activity, but you may not have to, they might not have that level of dependence on you as a provider. An important piece of that is that dependent participants for the purposes of the standard does not just mean children. So that image on the screen there is from an Outdoors Queensland Great Getaways activity. And that involved a group of people, older people over 55, canoeing on the North Pine River on that activity. So some of those participants had little or no experience paddling, and some of them had extensive experience, but as a group, they were dependent on the provider of the activity. So yeah, it's just an important thing to consider that dependent, as I said, doesn't mean, as a minor or someone who doesn't have that technical legal definition of dependent. It's actually about whether they're dependent on the provider of the activity. Any questions, comments on that one? Nope. Terrific. All right. The next couple of slides have got a few words on it, but this is really where I want to open it up to discussion. So the relevance, how is all of this relevant? As it says there, I'm not going to read out every word on the screen, but I'd really like it to talk about how anyone on the call has actually applied the Australian AAAS and good practice guides in your operations. So how has it been relevant? What difference does it make? Who needs to know about it? And there are probably a few different questions, but yeah, I really wanted to see if anyone wanted to make a comment. I just saw Brent's comment there from YMCA. Yeah, those instructors are all pretty good blokes. I've heard Brent too. So yeah, it was another good experience that we had there. So I guess, does anyone want to be brave and go first as far as applying the Australian Adventure Activity Standards, the good practice guides, in operation and how it's actually worked. Looking for volunteers. Has anyone done it? I'm sure some of you have. I know some of you have actually. This is a, I guess the key piece of this is that in applying it, the relevance of applying it and the reasoning for doing it are that, you know, that they are the guidance has been provided by experts from across Australia. And so I guess that's a key part of this, of why you'd use these documents. But yeah, it's really about what makes it important to go through this. And as I say there, it's not just about safety, it's also compliance and service delivery, as well as environmental and cultural protections. Just noticed Narelle's comment there, felt the standards weren't enough for us with regards to numbers, so we follow them, but made our own nudge judgment with regards to numbers of dependent children. Did you want to speak to that, Narelle? You're just on mute, yep.
Yes, we work with early childhood, so we looked at the numbers and do use them for insurance purposes, and we had a good look through all of the standards and the good practice guide and do follow everything. However, we're doing more than the standards and the good practice guide say, which we are comfortable with, and the insurance company that eventually did insure us were completely blown away with what we do in reference to the guides and the good practice guide and the standards. And so doing more for the younger children, we felt was completely necessary.
Yeah, yeah, and that's great. And I guess that's part of it too, Narelle, is putting it in the context of your participants and your operating environment. So it depends somewhat on the activity you undertake, but also particularly on the responsibility that you have for the participants that you're dealing with. And I think in the standard itself, it does have some ratios in relation to participants, number of participants to leaders, but it does specifically say in there, this is dependent on the operating environment and the participants themselves as well. So I think you've done the right thing completely there, and it's good to hear that that's been understood by putting it into the context of your operations.
Yes, and it depends what you're doing, of course. Nature play, there's a fair bit of bushwalking in what we do because we're more adventure-based than other bush kindies or programs that run things for children. We do some adventurous things, and bushwalking is part of that. So we have to have a good think about what are we comfortable with, what does it look like in early childhood centres when they take a bush kindy class into the outdoors, and what do we do? And we had to compare ourselves a lot to come up with the ratios that we felt we were comfortable with.
Yeah, terrific. And that's a key part of it, I think, is considering how you're doing it and what are you comfortable with as well. That's a really good point. Just noted, David, got your hand up, mate.
Yeah, thanks, Dom, and hi, everybody. Just tapping into the ratios discussion, I'll just put one up. I've been recently struggling with the bushwalking ratios. In a class 1 to 2 area, it's suggested or recommended or should be used for overnight minors 22 and adults 22. Then when you go to references at a state-based level, so in Queensland with Queensland Parks, they go 15. So it becomes quite hard, and I know it's a national standard, so you've got to find a middle ground on these recommendations. And I'm not trying to be critical of the work that's been done over many, many years to get this to a national level, but if I can't convince my boss which standard or which recommendation or which guideline I need to follow, then he'll always go for the one that has the larger group, unfortunately, because that suits the needs of my environment. And it makes a dichotomy for me as a professional that I want to be following the parks requirement and the best practice in the outdoor community, so we're seen as a good practitioner. But when the standard's not really a standard and it's not enforceable, it becomes problematic if you're a single operator or a single staff member trying to convince management to change a policy that they've done for years. It's just my viewpoint on it. I know there's no solution to this, and you've got to find a middle ground, like the last speaker, Narelle, just spoke of, but it's quite tricky.
Yeah, it is quite tricky, and it is, this is part of the challenge, I think, in relation to application of the standard. But you're right, when there's a difference between what a land manager expects and what the adventure activity standard comes to, sometimes it's a matter of finding the common ground, sometimes it's a matter of going to the higher expectation on that. But yeah, it certainly is a difficult one.
But Dom, the higher expectation of 15 people walking in a group as a maximum will never get past a school if they can go, oh, but this standard says it's 20 or 22.
Yeah.
So they'll sooner go with that because that's more likely to be the reality of a group size, regardless of where you're going, whether you're walking in a park in downtown Brisbane or at Mount Barney.
Yeah. Phil, did you want to comment on that, or did you have another comment or question?
Yeah, I suppose it's just that concept of the standard, and I think the single best thing about the AAAS is they are voluntary and they're guidelines. I don't think it's even remotely possible to have a consistent standard across Australia for all groups, in all businesses, in all frameworks, in all environments. And so the fact that it has flexibility, the example we use is our canoeing on Tinaroo Dam. You know, we'll work with more students on the water with one instructor, but we have systems and processes in place to manage the safety through the use of a powerboat, for example, to be able to position students out of the wind or tow them across a dam. So we've looked at the standard as we're required to as an Education Queensland school, and have then assessed the risk and come up with processes that we know work in our environment, but they won't work in everybody's environment, but they work for us. So I think that's the beauty of having a voluntary standard. It has to be a voluntary standard, because otherwise we're going to have this massive change to everybody being vanilla and everybody doing exactly the same thing across Australia.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, Phil, knowing you a little bit, that you've documented very well those variations to how you're operating from the Australian Adventure Activity Standard and Good Practice Guide.
And it's also 30 years of experience of doing it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I guess that's exactly what Narelle said too, as far as putting in context of the operating environment and the participants that you're dealing with. And that's exactly what this, I think that is a really good point, that's what the AAAS, I missed an A, allows you to do, is put it in context. It doesn't say you must use a particular ratio. It says, here's a ratio, you can modify it. The point that David's making is, if someone else says 15 and there's another standard that says 22, you know, from a cost point of view and a convenience point of view, people are going to try to go to probably the higher one, but it's also a matter of, within a certain context, you need to be able to make a case to say, no, in this context, we actually really need to go here. And the problem, I think, can be that it is only a recommendation, it's only guidance, and that is a challenge, I think. But I tend to agree. I like it as a voluntary standard. And I think we need to remember that bottom line on that slide at the moment there is, it's also environmental and cultural protections, which I think the guidance, to get guidance on that at this level is actually really important, because while we tend to focus a lot on safety of the participants, it's also about what's a good practice for the places and the spaces that we visit, and making sure that we're leaving those places and spaces when we've done our activities as we found them, and we're not causing damage to those spaces, or also possibly by conducting activities there, causing potential to lose access to some of those sites. And I think that's an interesting point in there, that part of the AAS is about ensuring ongoing access by making sure or providing guidance for people of how to actually deliver these activities in an appropriate way. And that could be from a national park, World Heritage area, down to a council park or someone's private property. It's just about looking after the spaces where we operate all the time as well, and providing that as well as looking after the people. So I think that's important. Sorry, I've sort of neglected the chat just for a moment. I just saw Narelle said likes the last line. Yeah, it is certainly important, and not using the environment without looking after it. It's I think the environment in its broader sense, we all need to look after it, and there's no doubt about that. Does anyone else have a comment on how you've applied this? I really like both of those are examples of applying it and possibly doing different things, but making sure you document it. I saw, Jen, you had a comment in there about not started running outdoor activities, but keen to start the right way. That's really good, and thank you for joining us today. Have you had a look at the adventure activity standards? Is this just your intro to it?
Yeah, I did have a bit of a look through it. We already run a camping facility here with a license for recreation outdoors, but we've never really dived into that just yet. But we're definitely heading in that direction. So very keen to get everybody's, opinions on how it's working for them. And, it's wonderful to hear, that yes, it's a set guidelines, but there's going to be times where I may need to adjust that. That's going to fit the needs of what we might end up doing out here.
Yep, and that's exactly, that's a really good point. Actually, I might just move on to the next slide because it pretty much touches on that. The third point there, it's not a rule book. It's all about guidance. So that guidance is coming from, experts right across Australia. The technical working groups who developed the standards were drawn from various different areas. Some people were from businesses. There was people from non-profit organisations. There was people from outdoor education. There was people from adventure therapy and adventure tourism. There were club members. It was really broad, and they're from right around the country. So the information that is in there is actually quite amazing. And one of the great things, I think, is it's free as well, and it's freely available through the website, which, the actual Standards Australia, you have to subscribe. You've got to pay to get access to those standards. These standards are freely available to anyone, whether you're just starting out in this space or whether you've been doing it for 30 plus years. It's there as a resource for all operators, and I think that's a key part of that. It's actually hosted by the Outdoor Council of Australia, which I'm a member of. I'm actually the president of the Outdoor Council of Australia at the moment. But the Outdoor Council of Australia is the host holder of the standards, and so it's on the website. It'll be on there. The intent is to keep it freely available to everyone as well. So again, I've sort of emphasised there, it's not only about safety; it is also the environmental and cultural concerns. But the bottom line there, which I think probably deserves a bit of extra talk or extra discussion, is that some land managers are making compliance with the Australian AAS and good practice guides a condition of permits, particularly for access by commercial operators. So as we've said, the Australian AAS is a voluntary standard, and compliance with it is not generally a legal requirement, but land managers regularly impose conditions on access. And I think there's probably I don't know if it's an unofficial rule or official rule, that generally land managers expect operators, commercial operators, to comply with higher standards of performance while on the land than they might expect from the general public. So this, I guess the question that comes from that as far as is it appropriate for land managers to impose that sort of standard on us? And I think part of it is, as an industry, we are looking to represent ourselves as responsible and having this level of concern for their spaces as well. So I think there is a certain level of expectation in there that that particularly commercial operators, and that goes probably for schools in outdoor education as well as you know, businesses in tourism, etc. But I'd like to put that out there as well, of what are people, you know, what's the take on that side of things, because that's certainly, it's happening in other states, and it, you know, it may happen in Queensland in the future as well. Not sure if anyone has any comments on that. Just looking at the group of people on here, I know there's a range of different people. Has anyone come across that? I know there's some from interstate already on the call, as far as having that sort of compliance requirement by different land managers.
DBCA over here in WA, Dom, bringing that in for, I know bushwalking is definitely on there, and I'm presuming there'll be more to come.
Yeah, thanks, Kim. So that's the Department of, sorry.
Biodiversity, Conservation and Attractions.
Okay. It used to be a really cool name like CALM, didn't it?
Yeah, and then there was,
and land management.
yeah, and then there's that deviation with parks and wildlife as well.
Okay.
So it kind of, yeah.
So is that only, it's only just being introduced now in WA to bring that in for commercial?
They're saying
operators?
it's coming. It's not here
right.
yet, but it's
Yeah.
coming.
Okay. Yeah. And I guess that's part of these sort of sessions, is understanding what that actually means. But again, one of the key questions that I would think is probably, and I don't know how the likes of, you know, a land manager, whether it's they just put in their conditions a dot point saying you will comply with the adventure activity standards and good practice guides. But the question I'd have if I was one of those providers is, what do I have to do to be able to sign on the dotted line that I am complying? And it comes back to David's comment and Phil's and Narelle's before about some of the changes that you can make. So is it substantive compliance with the standard, and you say, well, I'm either, Narelle's case, I'm actually exceeding it, and you know you're complying it, you'd certainly tick that box. But it might be the example Phil gave of, well, we've got a safety boat, so we know that we can exceed the ratios that are there in this particular environment. And, you know, those sort of things, I think it's also, maybe it needs to have some discussion of, in your systems, where you might say, we are complying with the Australian AAAS / good practice guides. However, we have made the following changes and we've got it documented, or we've made some changes which are documented in our systems. And I think that's an important part of this, the documentation of any of those changes and making that clear. And I guess it's a question on how you communicate that in that space. Other big question I did want to have in here and discuss, and I think I skipped past it before, is who should actually know about it? And I think it's a question within your organisation. Realistically, the Australian AAAS and good practice guides, because it's not a rule book, because it's providing guidance in the development of your procedures and policies. Realistically, as long as your workers, particularly your volunteers, and I always include volunteers in workers, as long as your leaders actually are aware of your policies, if your policies and procedures comply with the AAS, they don't necessarily need to have ever opened up the Australian AAS. I'm not saying they shouldn't, but if they're operating in your operating environment only, and your policies are sweet, then they should be right as far as compliance there. I think it's good for people to have an awareness of it at the leadership level, but I think the key part of this is at an organisational level, to have even just done a comparison of your existing policies and procedures, your standard operating procedures, whatever you call it, your risk management system, to what's in the guidance in the AAS, and actually do that comparison. You may not need to make any changes at all, but you should actually do that comparison. I think that's an important part of that process. Happy to take comments on that, or if you disagree, please say so, because I think it's one of those things where people think, oh, I'm not going to get my staff to read, the entire standard and each good practice guide for each activity we're conducting. And I don't think that's ever been the expectation, but I'm not sure that's been always clearly stated, that it's actually about informing your policies and procedures and your own rules, rather than expecting everyone to be able to quote different sections of the standard. Kim, yep.
I have a question, Dom. We use a lot of subcontractors to do fill-in activities for us. Recently we've worked with Adventure Out to do abseiling and zip lining and things like that. I think because I've come from the industry, I have a broad awareness of the standards and quite an in-depth risk management plan as well. But I think what worries me as a business owner is, how do I make it, whose standards do I go by in that way? Like, I'm aware of the Australian Adventure Activity Standards, but then I'm seeking a provider to come in and fill that place. How do I know that they're following the Australian Adventure Activity Standards, and how do I know that they're going to be a trustworthy organisation to come in to provide that activity, if that makes sense? Does that make sense to you? Like, how do I, as a business owner, go about that process?
Yep. I think some of it is literally having conversations about it, and some of it can be, as you go through, understanding what the person is doing, and sometimes it's why. It's asking questions about, well, are you aware, of this? And the other one, I think this is always interesting in relation to engaging subcontractors, is whose rules are you following? If they're operating at your site or with your clients, whose rules are you following, essentially? And sometimes it's not a problem at all, because everyone's rules are on the same page, but it's when there's a difference in those rules that you need to understand who's ultimately responsible in that space. And I think the only way that comes about is through having conversations and actually having it clarified right from the get-go. And that's not always, it's easier said than done, I think.
Yeah, I think that's true, but I think that's a very good point. Whose are you operating under? And that's a really good thing for insurance as well. It becomes a bit of a pain in the butt when you're working with a variety of people. But yeah, I mean, do you have an MOU with every single person that you work with to state that? I'm not quite sure. I guess it's a work in progress.
And sometimes it depends also what's in your agreement with them too, on how you've engaged them too. It could, that sort of level, and it depends how formal that arrangement is, I suppose. But yeah, I would think that having clarity on that is going to possibly avoid some awkward conversations in the future. So maybe it's just about that sort of process that you could have up front as well. But yeah, I think it is important to clarify. Yeah. David, do you have your hand up, mate?
Yeah, I'll add to what you said for Kim's comment, Dom. I think if you go into an outside provider, whether it's a single freelancer or a venue operator or a program provider or a campsite, ask for their risk assessments, ask for a copy of their SOPs. And if you're doing this before you've actually engaged with them in terms of finding, giving them money or a deposit, they're going to want you to have that information to keep you on board. But definitely it gives you a credibility level a lot more if you're prepared to share that, in a confidential manner with your clients by going ahead with that. I've got a second question though, and it's back to Phil's comment in the chat about EQ, the Adventure Activity Risk Assessment Standards. How closely does the room think that those align currently with AAAS? Because again, I get pushback from my organization management here about we don't have to follow that because we're not an EQ school.
Phil, yep. Do you want to answer that?
certainly the way in which the Education Queensland CARAs are written now, the Curriculum Activity Risk Assessments. So this is part answer. They specifically refer to the AAS. So it does require Education Queensland employees, when they're writing the risk assessment, which is the internal document, to refer to the AAS to inform the risk assessment and standard operating procedures. So that's certainly the EQ piece. The question you raise is exactly the same question I was asked by the principal of the private school I worked for in Brisbane, probably over 25 years ago, who said, why do we have to follow the industry standards, was the question I was asked. I said, because it's best practice.
Yeah, I think it's also, you've got to follow something. And why wouldn't we be following good practice / best practice when we're talking about the safety of our participants, the environmental control and the cultural protocols on those places where we carry out these activities. The piece I think that's important is that the Australian AAS was never intended to be a straitjacket. So that's the piece that there's a whole lot of should in there, but there's only a handful of must. And that was a deliberate decision. And I think you'd struggle to argue with any of the ones that say you must do X. Like it might say you must check the weather forecast. And I think most people wouldn't argue with that, you know, as far as running outdoor activities. And you know, you must comply with legal requirements. I don't think anyone's ever going to argue with that. You'd be doing well to argue with those things. But yeah, I think it is that piece of there is flexibility in these documents, and the industry, partly because they're industry developed and industry informed, that you know that we don't have a one size fits all industry. Particularly when we're talking about all of those different activities, and there's only, as I said before, I think it's 18 different activities covered in the good practice guides, but they also, the core good practice guide applies to, and was deliberately written to apply to other activities as well. So we're trying to provide guidance for all the different activities that are conducted in all the different environments right across a fairly large and wonderful country, and making sure that those standards have enough flexibility that they're not completely off the mark when it comes to running an activity in Tasmania compared to Cape York, compared to Broome, you know, or in the centre of Australia for that matter. So, you know, those sort of things are really important to this process. Sorry, did someone else have a comment just then? Matthew? Yes, mate.
Thank you. I just quickly asked a couple questions relating to accessibility in the standard. So I'm just looking at how the guideline addressing people who have physical needs might change around how the standard of what you have at the moment. It's because of the way how they, you know, mobility, it will impact on parts of the risk assessment, and also about the equipment designs and stuff. So I'm not sure if there been any discussion around the standards that can relate it to accessibility.
Yeah, there certainly was, Matthew, in the development of it. And I think that's partly, it's a little bit in the nuance of it, where it specifically talks about considering the needs of any group of participants. So, and also it could be specific individuals within a group, but it could be that larger group as far as the needs. And that also comes into, as you said, the equipment, but it comes into the environment where you conduct your activity. It comes into even the ratios that David touched on before. All of those different things relate directly to understanding the participants themselves. And there's a whole section in each of the good practice guides about your participants. But yeah, it's certainly, it's not something that it's written to stop people from delivering activities for people who might have accessibility issues. It's about considering that in your process and in how you're going to deliver the activities. So that was definitely in there, mate.
Thank you.
That's all right. Happy to help. Any other questions about you know, any of these things? I guess it's really about, as I said, the guidance from experts across Australia, and I think that's a key part of what this is. Yeah, so, and as I say, never intended to be a straitjacket or restrict people from actually delivering the outcomes that are available from outdoor activities or adventurous activities in this context. I'm just checking the comments. So David's common sense isn't always common. No, it isn't, mate. And then Ian's comment there about, in terms of liability claims, in the event of injury, lawyers and police, if necessary, and coroners in worst case, are looking at risk management compliance with the AAS when considering liability matters. Did you want to speak any more to that, Ian?
Yeah, I can do if you like. And was just talking to a particular provider just recently, and that was his comment that he's actually seen in practice in claims exactly what I just wrote there. Mm-hmm. So whilst it's currently a voluntary standard and it's a guide and that sort of thing, because it's so well, I suppose, trying to be as broad as possible and there's nothing else to latch onto, they're looking at businesses should be at least doing this much when doing their business and the way they conduct themselves, to try and demonstrate that they are being professional in everything they do and are offering all possible care and concern when they're conducting their business, that if things turn pear-shaped, they are looking at your compliance with this sort of stuff when lawyers want to get a look at it. And like I said, coroners and the police are looking at, are you doing these things within a certain framework and doing it safely?
Yep. And I think, you know, that then extends to, you know, if there is environmental damage, you know, were you operating in the appropriate manner? You know, sometimes, you know, bad things happen to good people, but there are times when you can go back and say, I documented this and we followed it. And that's the key part. And I think a big part of this is actually about not having a standard operating procedures manual that's sitting on the shelf. It's having a living document that is actually implemented across all your operations and having that level of professionalism, which you just touched on, Ian, across your organisation. And that includes whether you're a business or a non-profit organisation. So it is important from that point of view of making sure that everyone's on the same page in relation to those sort of concerns. Just conscious we're getting towards the end of our hour. I just have a couple of other things, but does anyone have any other questions in relation to, specifically in relation to the AAS, and even that last point there about compliance with the AAS / good practice guides as a condition of permits?
Dom,
yes, mate.
Sorry, I'm trying not to hog all the questions, but does anyone have any examples of how you make a SOP or a risk management plan a living document? Because I don't get buy-in from staff here. It sits in the back of the folder, doesn't get read or reviewed, and I'm the only one that looks at it. Are there any ideas out there apart from any ideas apart from making it a Word document? And
brainwashing and hypnosis, you mean? Yeah, I think one of the things that in my past experience, not necessarily, it was more about as a land manager in relation to staff working in the field. They actually did a lot of, we had a high focus on safety management system and dynamic risk assessments. So even literally redoing a risk assessment after lunch to see if any conditions had changed. And the staff literally did it on a notebook they kept in their top pocket, and they would fill out a very quick, has anything changed from when we did the full risk assessment? And what that meant was it put safety front of mind before every session or before every shift. So yeah, I think that's a key part of that. But the hard bit is getting it ingrained in the culture. and getting, you know, even reporting incidents and reporting near misses is a key one on that, so that systems can be improved. And yeah, I think that's important. Narelle's just put that's an interesting one, Narelle, a picture checklist for staff at the start of the day. Wow. And then referring to it throughout the day. That's terrific. Donna's just put, Girl Guides use 3 questions. What are your 3 questions, Donna? Do you want to share them with us?
Yeah, sorry. We have our risk management plans and we have our SOP plans.
Yep.
And then we have these 3 questions that we get leaders to do. What are they doing? What can go wrong? And what are they extra they're putting in place to make sure nothing's going to happen? So
Yep.
we try and get leaders to revigorate that every time they go and do an activity, even though they've still got their risk management plan, and it also makes them look at their risk management plan and see if they need to add anything.
Yep, terrific. So your 3rd question is really, how do we make sure it goes right?
That's it. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yeah, I like that. Yeah, and that's that whole thing of, I mean, we say it sometimes in jest, what could possibly go wrong, but is actually what your safety management system is all about, is what could possibly go wrong and what are we going to do about it, you know, and what's reasonable, what reasonable activities, reasonable controls can we put in place. It's terrific. I just noticed Narelle's list of interesting situations: evacuations, cancellations, wild animals, snakes, goannas, goats, deer, and flooding rains. I'm not sure which one I'd pick first out of those, but yes, weather and COVID have certainly made all sorts of risk assessment challenges throughout all of our activities. Yeah. Just about finish up on this at the moment. We'll post all of this on our website. We're also happy to have ongoing conversations, particularly at our coffee and conversation sessions. But I did want to flag a couple of things before we finish up. The Outdoors Queensland Awards nominations just opened yesterday for this year. So we've revised the award categories. So please check out our website. There's different people on this group have actually been finalists and winners of the awards in the past. I'd really encourage people to have a look at it and nominate. The awards they're your awards. We call them Outdoors Queensland Awards, but they're the outdoors community in Queensland. And we're trying to make sure they're relevant to everyone across the sector. And it's about recognising the size and diversity of the outdoor community and opportunities for people to be recognised for their contributions. But it also raises the profile of the outdoors and outdoor activities and the environment in relation to the lifestyle that we have across the state. Yeah, so Narelle just said some new sections. Yeah, we've just done a revision and trying to sort of put the awards into different types of activity rather than what we had previously. So yeah, the judges have sort of done a bit of a refresh on it. So feel free to have a look. And yeah, we've tried to make sure there's a slot for everyone in there. Just a reminder as well, Coffee and Conversation, we hold them on the first Friday of each month. So the next one is the 1st of July. Mark's just shared the link there. You do need to register. So there's that one. And that pretty much brings us to a close. Thank you very much for everyone who attended and contributed. Another big thank you to Mark for all the work that goes on behind the scenes, and to the other Outdoors Queensland staff. We're going to run some more single issue forums like this one, a couple more in the rest of the year. So our next one's penciled in for Tuesday, the 19th of July. And we're actually thinking of tackling the thorny issue of insurance for outdoor organisations in that one. So we'll get some more information out there shortly on that. But the recordings and the presentation, the links are available on our website. Mark's just shared the link there. Jen, you are able to take part in the coffee and chat. Yep, certainly are. Register on the website. You don't have to be a financial member to do that. It's about reaching out to the whole industry, and we'd be happy to have you there. So they're 11 a.m. first Friday of each month, again via Zoom. So yeah, please join us when you can. But yeah, thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. It's great to see familiar faces and some new faces in the virtual room today. So thank you very much. I'm going to sign off with my little tagline that I stole from a podcast, which is look after yourselves, look after others, and look after the planet. Thanks very much for coming.